just finished the first year of a 3-year study, but I hope that you still have a lot of interesting information you can come away with about the questions we're interested in, how we're approaching those questions. So you stole my thunder a little bit. How many people have seen a fisher? I always like to ask that question, but that's okay. So I'm going to start with just some general background. Some of you may be well aware of everything, but I just want to make sure everyone is sort of on the same page going forward. Fishers are a member of the best mammalian family, the Mustelidae. That's not a biased opinion. That's fact. So they're a weasel. They're a member of the weasel family. Weasels themselves are a really cool group. They all share some morphological traits, but it's a really diverse group. It includes our smallest carnivore species, the least weasel. It includes the biggest species is a sea otter or giant otter. I forgot to look that up, but one of the otter species is the biggest in the group. But it includes a lot of, some diversity in form. They're all sort of long and skinny. They're all at least partially carnivorous, but there's a lot of different ways that they go about doing what they do, from semi-aquatic species like mink, aquatic species that live in freshwater, otters, to sea otters that live in the ocean. We have burrowing species like the badger. So it's a group that I really like. A lot of my work since coming to grad school is really focused on different species of weasels. Within the weasel family, the martens, fishers, wolverines, this top species called tyra. Has anyone heard of a tyra before? So they live in South and Central America. They are related. So they form this smaller clade within Mustelidae. The technical term is galaninae. That doesn't sound very good. So we also call it the Martes species complex. And so they fit within this group where they share a lot more traits. Most of these species are northerly in distribution, although there are some martens that live in the tropics. But we, with wolverines, fishers, there's 8 species of marten. They overlap a lot in terms of range and ecology. And so I fortunately was just at a conference in Scotland about a month ago focusing on this group. And so it was really nice to hear some of the cool new results coming in from Brazil on tyra, and wolverines are always one of those species that anytime I hear a talk on it, I learn something new, and it's impressive what they're able to do in terms of movements and all these other things. So just some general background on fishers. What do fishers eat? They are what we call a facultative generalist, which is a really fancy term to say they eat a bunch of different stuff depending on what's available. So we always like to say if they can catch it and it fits in their mouth, they're going to eat it. Some of the common prey items, especially northern Minnesota, snowshoe hare, porcupines, they are sort of notorious as one of the few mammalian predators that can actually kill porcupines not without getting quilled. They do get quilled, but without dying from that interaction. There is some more recent work suggesting that other carnivores can do that a little better than we thought. But they do have this special relationship with porcupines. Actually, the reason that they were reintroduced in Wisconsin in the mid-1900s was because of concerns that there were too many porcupines and there was damage on the trees. And so they brought them back to try to control porcupine populations. They will scavenge deer. Sorry for the roadkill deer picture. They will scavenge roadkill deer, but they also scavenge deer that are killed by other factors, including wolves. So they eat a lot of different things. They eat small mammals, squirrels. We'll revisit this question with some of our preliminary data from southern Minnesota towards the end of the talk. The other thing I want to mention, which is something that we've been working on for a few years, what they eat actually has a really important, gives them a really important role in the forested ecosystems that they live. Anyone want to guess what this is? This is a spore from a type of mycorrhizal fungi. And so the small mammals and the squirrels that they eat mycorrhizal fungal fruiting bodies. And when fishers eat them, they actually help disperse those spores. So we think this is a really underappreciated role that fishers play in our forest ecosystems, is them and other carnivores helping move these spores around. So reproduction is something that's an interesting topic in carnivores in general, but especially fishers. They have what's called delayed implantation, which I'm sorry, I should follow my order here. So fisher juveniles are called kits. If you hear me say kits, that's what I'm talking about. They are born in early to mid-March, probably more towards mid to late March in this part of their range. The average litter size in Minnesota is from northern Minnesota is 2.5. That's may become important later, so keep that in the back of your mind. They have a single litter a year. The range is 1 to 4. We've never documented fishers in any setting having more than 4. The interesting thing is they have delayed implantation. So within about a week of giving birth, one or multiple males show up at the reproductive den, essentially harass the female until she says, yeah, okay, we can mate. And they're functionally pregnant the entire year other than that week. And so what happens is that embryo starts to develop, it pauses as a ball of cells. And it's not until the next 40 days before the next whelping season that actually implants and develops. So it allows them to, when they're in a predictable spot, a male can find them and mate. And then it's not until the next winter when the body says, yeah, I've got enough resources, let's go through with that it implants and develops. Yeah, so delayed implantation. And the females raise the kits alone. There is some evidence that males, if they find kits and they know they weren't the father, they will actually kill them to help the female have a better chance of surviving till next year. Delayed implantation is incredibly common in carnivores. There are some rodents as well. It looks a little different in different species, so the full year thing isn't necessarily the norm. Martens have delayed implantation too, but they don't breed till the summer. Yeah. Yeah, the question was how long is gestation? And gestation is about 40 days for fishers. Yep. 40, yep. So a little bit of background on habitat. We're going to challenge this a little bit by the end of the night, but it's still basically true. Fishers are forest dependent. Non-forest is generally not habitat. They might be able to move through non-forest. They might be able to actually use like shrubby areas that don't really have a forest canopy. But by and large, they need forests to do what they do and get the resources they need to survive and reproduce and be happy little fishers. But not all forest is created equally. So they're really strongly associated with structurally complex forests. These tend to be old growth forests or older second growth forests that have complex structures and characteristics, things like large trees with cavities, stumps, down woody debris, some uneven ground, rock structures, caves, root mass tip-ups. And these provide really important functions for fishers, places for them to rest, places for them to give birth to their kits and care for them. They help in the predator avoidance part of it. So there are predators that kill fishers. They provide thermal protection and prey habitat. And so when we look at forests from the eyes of a fisher, if you think of a red pine plantation, very even age, not a lot of vegetation in some of them, that's not a very good stand for fishers. Not to say they won't use it, they will. But they tend to do best and their densities tend to be highest where we have older forests that provide more of these complex structures. We have some concerns, not just in Minnesota. This is a North American wide concern about fisher habitat and how we manage our forests and what that may or may not do to fisher habitat. Part of that concern centers on how much complex forest we have. So as we manage the forest with clear cuts and other harvest strategies, we tend to fragment that landscape. We tend to remove good habitat and replace it with not very good habitat. And where some of these concerns lie is really with respect to their reproductive dens. So these are the sites that they gave birth to their kits, and then they leave their kits, which are very dependent on the females for a couple months until they start moving and really doing things on their own. So they're really important to protect the kits when the mom's out foraging. They're important for the female to be protected from predators and from males, as I mentioned earlier, while they're caring for their kits. So this is a picture of a reproductive den from northern Minnesota and this aspen tree. And if you think of the opening size that a pileated woodpecker produces, that's about right for fishers. They don't only use woodpecker produced cavities, but that's about the right opening size where a female can get in, but a male fisher and other predators can't. And here's a couple kits from out in the southern Sierra Nevada mountains. So we have good data from a DNR study in Minnesota. They only give birth and raise kits in tree cavities. They will not use any other structure. We don't really understand why that is. Martins related, they use a lot of tree cavities too, but they will use burrows on the ground and other things. Fishers don't. The only time they'll use something in Minnesota here, hollow logs, is really late in the kit dependent cycle where kits are moving around a lot, and then they'll use some logs. Here in Minnesota, most of the trees they use are living trees. They will also use dead trees. And that might relate to just what's available. It might relate to living trees providing a little more insulation in March when they're giving birth to their kits. So that's the general background. I'm going to move now to some history of fishers in Minnesota and really the region and sort of what their status is right now. This blue color isn't super great on the eyes. Sometime I'll update this slide. But this shows the historical distribution of fishers in this region. Even Iowa and Illinois and Ohio used to have a good number of fishers. But in the late early 1900s, we basically lost fishers from this region. I do want to point out that Manitoba and Ontario still had some. I just haven't gone back and fixed this slide. But really, these dates here are the years when fishers were officially considered extirpated. You may notice that I have a question mark in Minnesota. We almost certainly never lost all of our fishers. With areas that humans didn't really go and log, we have some good tracts of land that fishers almost certainly were still present, but they were still considered extirpated. Seasons were closed in 1929. And the cause of that decline was really a combination of unregulated harvest for fur. So you could go out and kill as many as you wanted. They don't reproduce a lot, so they are sensitive to that extra mortality source. But it was also based on how we logged the landscape and really changed what habitat was available. This is close to what we have today. This is from a recent paper back in the early 2000s. And so you can see that blue line, the historic distribution. The gray is really more or less where we have fishers today. So there was a couple of reintroduction, translocation. I'm using these loosely, but they reintroduced fishers into the UP of Michigan and into Wisconsin several times in the mid-1900s. This blue line is where they took some fishers from the reintroduced population and moved them farther east to help them in the UP. And here in Minnesota, they recovered from natural recolonization. Between the 1950s and 1977, we started to see incidental trapping. They started to show up more long before we had trail cameras to tell us that they were back. But by 1977, they reopened a trapping season. More recently, we have had more expansion in their peripheral range here in Minnesota. That's really the topic that I'm going to spend a lot more time on tonight. This is a picture of a fisher in downtown Hastings that was sent to the DNR. So that's not typical fisher habitat running across a parking lot. Even, I like to tease people from Iowa. I apologize if you're from Iowa, but even lowly Iowa has had fishers recently. We actually had a fisher sighting sent to us from someone in Iowa this spring. So they have moved all the way down into Iowa. We right now don't really know exactly the source of them spreading down. In Minnesota, we've sort of seen them spread down over time. You know, we kind of tracked their expansion to Otter Tail County by reports of wolverines. They weren't wolverines, but we get occasionally some reports of wolverines that end up being fishers. So that's a question we'd really like to look at in the future. In general, though, our population in Minnesota has declined by about 50% over the last 20 years. This is DNR population modeling data in black. And then the red line is their winter track index. So really a lot of congruence between those two trends. So this is something that we've been concerned about. We've really been interested in fishers for a long time here, but a lot of the work I've done since I became a researcher, finished grad school, has really focused on understanding what's going on in fishers in northern Minnesota. I'm not going to talk much about it tonight, sorry. Happy to answer questions or chat after. We have leveled out, so this is an old figure, but we really have leveled out. We don't see an increase, we don't see a continued decline. And so we're at a level, you know, around 10,000 fishers that's okay. You know, that's, if we stay there, we're going to be okay. But they have recently been listed as endangered in South Sierra Nevada. So really understanding why they declined is important so that if we see future trends, we can work to reverse them. The cavities that they use for reproductive dens take at least 80 years to develop. And so if we're going to continue to provide that habitat, we need to think now about how we manage our forests and how we can retain those while also balancing economic uses of our forests. So we're not in this situation now, but we want to make sure we never get there. All right, so now I'm going to switch and focus more on what we're doing in southern Minnesota and why. So what's interesting is we have a declining population in their core range that's simultaneously spreading south. And, we know, I'll go through the data actually, sorry, putting the cart before the horse here. So we know that we've had range expansion going on for the last several decades. This is data that the DNR has been collecting of confirmed reports of fishers. Some of these are roadkills. Some of these are animals that were incidentally trapped in raccoon traps, for example. More recently, we've got a lot of sightings from trail cameras. And so when you look at this graph, it's really tempting to look and say, wow, the fisher population has really kind of exploded down there. And maybe it has, but we know that one of the reasons over the last, since 2016 that we have so many sightings is that more people know we want them and more people have trail cameras out. And so we're seeing them a lot more. So we know they're there. We know they've been there since 2005, at least a few. But we really don't know a lot more about them down in southern Minnesota. This map shows, and this is out of date. One of these days, I'm going to actually update that figure in the previous slide in this map. But these are confirmed sightings of fishers in southern Minnesota from 2005 till I think the last time I updated this was probably pre-pandemic, but around that time. And what you can see, the green is the forest cover. A lot of our sightings are occurring in areas where we have forests. They need forests, right? It makes sense. But we also see a lot of sightings showing up in areas where there's not a lot of forest. I do want to emphasize that this includes the greater Twin Cities metro. If you think you saw a fisher and you have a picture, send it to us. We'd love to look at it and let you know and add it to our database. But, we do see them reproducing within the metro. So this is a female and her kit. These are the kingfishers you might remember from the first slide. So we know reproduction is happening. We know that they're occurring in forests and places we expect, but we also know that they're not exactly doing what we would expect. If you would have asked me 10 years ago if we would expect fishers to be some of the places we're finding them, I would have said no, and I would have been wrong. So this is obviously, you can see the shadows. This is the edge of a forested stand, but it's out in the middle of, a field on the edge of the stand. We've seen them crossing fields. Some of the roadkills that we've gotten reported to us are in areas that I don't know where they're coming from. I don't know where they're going, but there's nothing habitat-wise for them within miles. So we got support from the LCCMR and the Environmental Natural Resource Trust Funds to do a project in southern Minnesota. And really the goal of this project is to give us a better idea of the distribution, the status, and the general ecology of fishers in southern Minnesota. And really that's the purpose of this, is it's a baseline. So we know what's going on now. We know they're here, but we don't know, are they doing well? Or are they just scraping by? That is really important information to compare to the north to see if they're doing well here, why, what is different between here and there, right? And there's some land managers we've talked to who really want local information that they can build into their management plans. So we have 3 different objectives. I'll kind of go through them now and then go through how we're addressing them, some early results. The first is really to describe the distribution and population status. We have this great sighting database largely from the public, but we want to go out and actually do a survey and see, well, are they here? If we look for them, where are we finding them? It gives us a little more information than just waiting for the sightings to come in. The second objective is to evaluate movements, home range size, habitat selection. So how are they using this landscape that's very different in certain ways from northern Minnesota? And finally, we want to, obviously, as I just said, provide the data to support fisher management. So what are they eating? What are key prey? How are they reproducing here? And what's their survival look like and mortality factors? So I'm going to go through these one at a time. Our main approach to really understanding and describing the distribution and population status is by conducting a camera survey. So again, we see fishers in a lot of areas we don't expect, and those might just be fishers dispersing through. But if we get cameras out and we see repeated visits by fishers over a longer period of time, it helps us know, number one, where there's fishers that we can go put collars on. But number two, it helps us know, what do these sightings mean? If we just, if someone reports a sighting, we go and put a survey station up and we don't detect them for 2 months, that gives us more evidence that a fisher might have just been moving through. And so what we're doing is we have 100 sites, about 100 sites that we're surveying. We did a survey last fall. We're in the middle of our survey this fall. And at each of those sites, we have one camera. They're up for about 6 weeks, plus or minus, how long it takes us to get back from Duluth. And what we're doing at each of these sites, and I tell you this because I've talked to a lot of people that are like, well, I want to know if there's fishers on my land. Well, this is information. If you want to know, you could use our methods, which work really well for detecting fishers. So what we're doing is we're picking a site, generally in a stand that should be old enough that fishers should have some of the resources they need. We're going out, we're finding some microhabitat. In this case, it was a log. In some cases, it's a big tree. We're putting 2 ounces of salmon oil, putting something we call, that's a lure called skunk junk. It smells like skunk a lot more than it smells like junk. We're putting those up, we're putting a camera out, and these are really good attractants to basically every carnivore that we have in Minnesota. Bobcats don't always play by the rules, but basically anything else is going to come check this out. Yes, question. Yeah, so that's a really good question. We have 2 main study areas. I didn't mention this on the last slide. One of them is the greater Twin Cities metro area. And so we're a little more limited there to parks and green spaces that we have access to that may have enough habitat that fishers are more likely to be there. And then our other study areas in southeastern Minnesota, which is more contiguous habitat. And so we've used, I can tell you details later. I'm just going to say we've used a robust randomized design so that we, down in the southeast especially, we have a 1 kilometer or 2 kilometer, I can't remember now, a grids that we put over the landscape, and we randomly selected a candidate stand in each of those, and that's where we go put the camera out. Yeah, so we're putting them places that we don't expect to see them too. Good question. Another question. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. The question was, what do fishers do in the winter? Are they still active? Do they store food? Do they hibernate? On really cold days, they will reduce activity, but they're active. They're out there getting after it 24/7, 365. They're out in the winter. I'll show some images in a little bit of some of the winter snow tracking we've been doing. Yeah, in some populations, they change what prey they target. So small mammals may be harder to get when they're operating under the snow. But yeah, they're out in the winter moving around. Again, on a cold day, they might stay in their rest site a little longer. But another question. Yeah, the question was, why did we choose the fall, September to October? Based on available resources and based on the sort of question of where are they, this was a good time. There was previous research in northern Minnesota looking at different seasons and when fishers were more likely to be detected. And so we picked it for that. There's other studies elsewhere too that have shown that the fall is a really good time. We do have the chance of detecting juveniles dispersing, so that might change how we interpret our data. We don't necessarily know if it's an adult or a juvenile. But yeah, it's just a time of year that the fisher population is towards the high point of their annual cycle, and it's just they're moving around, and it's a good time to detect them where they're present. Do you have questions? Yeah, so why are they called fishers? I don't know why I removed this slide. I should have kept it in. They do eat fish. They will eat fish if it's available. In fact, we had one in Hastings near Hastings that I'll give more information later, but her last meal was a bunch of fish. So they're not called fishers because they kill and eat fish. No one really knows is the answer, but it's probably the Dutch word for polecat is vischer, and it's probably just that Europeans originally thought that they were something other than what they were, and it kind of changed from there. But no one really knows the answer to that. Just so I can make a joke about kingfishers, I think. So what did we find? We found fishers. So I'll just go through a few of our pictures here from last fall. This is a male. We can tell from the size of it and the size of the head. This is a female. We're pretty sure that she was one of our first to wear a GPS collar based on where this picture was taken and where we caught one. But you can see on this picture, that sort of dark area, that's the salmon oil. The reason we like salmon oil is that it doesn't wash away with the rain. And so it really stays there and it keeps that scent. And so this was a repeat visitor, this particular fisher, that they'll keep coming back and checking it out. And we have raccoons, coyotes, foxes, in the north, bears, wolves, Canada lynx, literally everything, weasels will come and check this out. Yep. And the skunk as well. The skunk sort of gives a longer distance scent that a lot of carnivore skunks will come and check it out as well. When a skunk sprays, that's something that's curious to see for them to come and see what happened. So our results from last fall in the metro, we had a few issues. So we only surveyed 36 of our 50 sites. We didn't have any equipment stolen, which is awesome. We detected fishers at 3 of our sites. So that's not far off from what we expected. So about 8% of our sites had fishers. We were actually able to radio collar one of those. In the southeastern area, very different story, 50 cameras, 1 camera was stolen, 4 of our SD cards were stolen. We were pretty bummed out, but about half of the sites had fishers in them. And so we didn't know what to expect. We know there'd been sightings in those areas, but until you go and do the work, you never know. And we were kind of worried, like, are we going to find fishers? But we have, and there are probably a few more down there than we expected. So with this objective, don't worry about the words. There's a lot. I'm repurposing a slide, a presentation here, but we have actually now finished analyzing our fall 2022 data. One of the things we're really interested in is how long does it take fishers to find our cameras? And the answer is generally within a week or 2. We have somewhere they didn't find them till about 3 weeks, but generally within 3 weeks, I think all of our detections were within 3 weeks of when we set up the site. We have started to do habitat measurements of these sites. So that's some of the statistical modeling that we'll do. We're resurveying them. And so we'll be able to look at how the landscape and the site factors influence whether they're present, but also whether they're present from year to year. So that's something that we're really interested in terms of the status. Is it an animal dispersing through, or is it actually a resident fisher that lives there? We are soliciting public sightings. We haven't done a big call for that yet because we're working on a database right now, but I'll give you more information later. If you or anyone you know has seen a fisher, especially if they have a picture of tracks, a trail camera picture, a video from a Ring doorbell, we'd love to hear about it. And I'll talk more about that right at the end. So our second objective, really looking at movements, habitat use, home ranges. For this, we're using a combination of methods, GPS telemetry. So we're trapping them in the winter. We're putting a little GPS collar. I should have brought one. It gives us a location. Actually, I think that's the next slide. So we're doing that. This is a fisher from southern Minnesota that we collared last winter. We are also, while we're out trapping, some days you don't catch anything but a couple raccoons. So we're finding fisher tracks, which is hard to see, but there are a set of fisher tracks in that image on the right. And we're going with a high precision GPS following the track so we can look at movement too. How are they moving across the landscape? Are they on edges? Are they avoiding some of these open places? So last winter, we had a few administrative delays, but we were able to get out for a short trapping season. We were able to get 5 collars out, 4 of those in southeastern Minnesota, 1 sort of in the Twin Cities metro over towards Hastings. These collars, our goal is 28, so we'll try to put about 15 to 20 collars out this winter, and then next winter we'll finish things up. The collars are giving us a location attempt every 1 to 3 hours, and it's not that some collars are giving 3, some are giving 1. They're actually varying. We're trying to maximize with the battery life so that we have some days where we're getting hourly, and then kind of most days we're getting 2 to 3 hours, depending on whether it's a male or a female. We're also getting activity data. I'll kind of show you what some of these data look like. Fortunately, I don't have a big summary, but This is actually from northern Minnesota. We are being a little bit protective of where we have animals in the south right now. But this is the type of data we're getting. So this is a set of GPS data from a female fisher up in the Superior National Forest. And so you can see it gives us a really good idea of where she went, where she didn't go, how much space. So a home range, how much space does she require? And one of the things we're really interested in is fisher densities and how many fishers we can actually support in available habitat in southern Minnesota. That's a big objective of the study. And one of the ways we're looking at that is home range size. So females don't overlap home ranges with other females other than their kits. Males won't overlap with other males. Males will overlap generally with multiple females to enhance mating opportunities. And so one of the questions, and I will say these are preliminary data, so don't get too attached to the early results. But in northern Minnesota, our average male home range size is about 36 square kilometers. Someone always asks me the conversion to square miles, but I can never remember. It's in the low teens, I'm pretty sure. A lot of space for a small weasel. In southern Minnesota, we were only able to collar one adult male, and it had the exact mean. So it seems like males are using a similar size, but we need more samples. Females in the north are using about 16 square kilometer home ranges, somewhere around 6, 7, 8 square miles. In southern Minnesota, our females are using a lot smaller home ranges. And so if that result continues to hold as we get more samples, that would suggest the resource density is higher and that we have a lot higher density population of fishers down in the south than we do in the north. So that's something that we're really interested in seeing if that pattern holds true as we get more data. Activity data, I'm not going to bore you with the details. These are plots of the activity counter that are in the collars. And all you need to know is that time is on the horizontal axis here. Each point is a single reading every 90 seconds. And the higher the value, the more physical motion was happening. And so what you can see very clearly from this is that there's periods where they're active and there's periods where we're not. And so this is something we're really interested, especially in the metro. A lot of carnivores living in human-dominated landscapes shift their activity patterns to be primarily nocturnal so that they don't have to be out when humans are. But if all the carnivores are doing that, that could have some interesting implications for how those carnivores interact with each other. So that's something that we're really interested to see activity patterns in southern Minnesota, northern Minnesota, more human-dominated landscapes, how those patterns change. As we're out tracking our animals that we have collars on, we get to do my favorite thing, which is see what they're up to. And so these are a couple of the cavities, rest sites that we found this winter. Some of these we found by snow tracking, others from tracking our animals. They rest a lot in tree cavities in the winter as well because it's a warm place for them to go. But this is really, we know that they use a variety, squirrel leaf nests, they'll use some burrows, they use tree cavities, obviously. But having information what they're doing down here is really helpful. We can't take our information from northern Minnesota and tell people in southern Minnesota how to manage landscapes. Some of the tree species are the same, but it's a different forest community. We did have a snow track of fisher up to this. This actually wasn't us. This came to us from a member of the DNR, but this was a cave that a fisher was resting in this winter. Really high quality fisher there that can appreciate a good view. This is the view right outside of that cave. So wouldn't mind setting up shop there myself. But again, these are the sort of insights that you can't get if you don't get out in the field and follow the critters around and see what they're up to. Again, they like to change our expectations. So this open area, I spent an hour and a half tracking a fisher through this open area. It was checking out muskrat huts on the edge of a cattail marsh. In this area, it was following some cottontail tracks. This sort of open area, we generally think of as being a really bad place for a fisher because predators, if they encounter a predator, they don't have any tree to climb. But I also trust that fishers know what's good for them. And so if they're hunting these areas, then the benefit outweighs the cost. So objective 3, data support management. And it looks like I should be finishing right in about 5 minutes. So and happy to answer questions as long as that takes. So we are really interested. We did not set this study up as a pure survival study, but the animals that we track will give us insights on how they're surviving down here. There are some risk factors that they don't have to contend with a lot in parts of northern Minnesota. One of them is vehicle collision. So we know that fishers down here are susceptible to this. We get reports every year from conservation officers and members of the public that find a fisher dead on the road. We're generally trying to work with people to get samples from that animal so it can help us understand what fishers are doing. I'm going to warn you, there is an image of another, I should have done it before this, I'm sorry. There is an image of another dead fisher on the next slide. It's not super graphic. It's a little closer than this one. This was an animal that we were monitoring this year near Hastings. She gave birth to, if I'm remembering correctly, 3 kits. She was killed within a few weeks of that by a coyote. All signs point to coyote. So again, how are these other predators interacting? In the north, the main predator is bobcats. Is predation pressure as high in the south? Are there other predators that they have to worry about? Those are questions that we're really interested in. And in 2 years, if you invite me back, I'll hopefully have some answers. Reproductive dens, we're really excited to follow. We know reproduction is happening in the south, but we're really excited to follow our first 4 litters this spring rather. I can't get my season straight. They're using cavities in trees, not surprising, but in this case, here's a big oak cavity and then another aspen. So that reminded me of some of the dens that we found up north. This is the fun part. You put up a camera. I don't know if you guys can see well, but this female fisher is carrying a kit in her mouth. So there's 1, there's 2. She's moving them to another den. Coming back, this is a different camera. If we just put 1 camera up, we always miss them. She came back looking around. Here she comes with number 3, and there she goes with number 4. So that was our first litter that we were able to count down there, and that's as many as they can have. So with small home ranges, big litter size, we're thinking, wow, maybe they're doing a lot better than we thought. Still have some work to go on that. But when we look again, comparing to this is just comparing within our study areas down here. We have 5 reproductive dens that we found. That's 2 different individuals, but they move them to multiple dens. We have not actually found a reproductive den in the metro because unfortunately that female was killed by a coyote right as we're going to find that. We do have 4 litter size estimates from 4 different litters. So in the metro, litter size of 3, the other 3 average a litter size of 3. So we had a 2, a 3, and a 4. So right now our average litter size down here is 3, which is a half a kit per litter more than the north. We don't have the sample size to be too confident in that yet, but early signs again do point to reproduction being pretty good down here. We're interested in what they're eating. I said I'd come back to it. Here I am. So this on the left, we like to call that brown gold. So that's really valuable sample for us. That's a scat sample. And then as we're handling them, we'll remove a little bit of their fur, really just like 15 guard hairs that we then send off to look at the isotopic composition. That can also tell us what they're eating. So these are methods that we're using. We're too early to give you any numbers right now, but we do have some preliminary data. Some of our sightings that we've gotten has actually showed interactions with fishers eating possums. We've also seen images of possums successfully fending off fishers, so it's not always as easy as they think. From the scats we've looked at, we have found sites where fishers have been scavenging deer. We have scats where we found a lot of cottontails right now, some small mammals, mice, voles, shrews. One of the fun ones, depending on whether you'd rather see a flying squirrel or a fisher. We had one fisher that was able to remove her collar, and right outside of the collar, she actually tore it apart. And so it's fun to show up at a tree and see your collar broken apart on the ground. But right next to it was a little gut pile and a tail from a southern flying squirrel. So they do eat gray squirrels as well. We've had some of the animals we've necropsied have had gray squirrels as well. So we really, again, I'm not to the point of giving you firm numbers or conclusions, but it does seem that a lot of the reason probably that they have small home ranges, if that holds, and at least as good of reproduction as they have in the north, is that they have a really good prey community that they're able to rely on down here. A lot of gray squirrels, fox squirrels, cottontails. So I told you I'd come back to this too. Sightings and roadkills wanted. If you know of anyone that catches a fisher, sees a fisher, has a picture, we prefer to have pictures because that helps us verify. If you don't, still send it to us. If it's credible, we'll still include it as an unverified observation in our database. If you know of a roadkill and you report that to a conservation officer, we will ultimately, hopefully, work with them to get that sample, which gives us really valuable samples in our study. So there's a few different ways I can actually send this so that we can send it out to the group. There's an email address we have set up you can email to. We also have a Google form that you can fill out. You do need a Gmail email account to be able to fill out that form. I've tried. I have not figured out how to take that off. So either one of these works. My email is on the 2 slides from now, the last slide. So feel free to email me as well. So finally, this is sort of the end, and we'll go to Q&A. This is not a one-person show. Really, really great team of people we have working. I don't know what I just did. So I'll just keep talking. Hopefully this is going to come back on. I don't know if this is plugged in, right? Hopefully it comes back. What I was going to mention is we have a lot of partners down here. They are listed, and I'm not going to name them off because I'm going to forget someone and then I'm going to feel bad about it. But a lot of good teams, especially in the Metro, working with us, the DNR. And my crew has done a really great job on this project as I'm up in Duluth running the project. And there were 2 individuals, Danielle Brown and Kesley Sechrist, that I just want to make sure I name, because they've done a lot of the fun but challenging part of chasing the fishers around after the collars go out. Did I kick something? Okay. Well, it sounds like the display is going to come back. All you're going to see, I will let that slide with the acknowledgements stay up so that people are properly acknowledged. I do want to verbally acknowledge again, this project is funded by the Environmental Natural Resource Trust Fund. They've been a really good funder of a lot of the fishery research that we've done in the state. So it's coming back, but yeah. So with that, when this comes back, I'll show the acknowledgements so folks can actually read the names of everyone that's contributed. And then the next slide is just questions. So I'm happy to start with the Q&A. I will put that back once the display comes back so folks can see my email address. So I'm going to start back here because I saw your hand go up first, but we have time for everyone. Yeah, so fishers are about that big. Yeah, so they're actually longer than a cat, but females weigh less than a cat. But if you see one, it would appear larger generally than a house cat just because they're longer. Martins are a bit smaller. They're a shade bigger than mink, but they're more in the mink range. And in terms of weights, females, they're sexually dimorphic. So female fishers typically weigh 6 to 7 pounds, sometimes 8. Males, it's funny because I talk to people, they're like, oh, I saw a 25-pound male. It was huge. You didn't. They're smaller than that. It probably looked that big, but they're really mostly in the 12 to 15-pound range. 15 is a pretty good size male. Yep. Yeah. For them, and also what's a typical life? Yeah, so the question was typical lifespan and mortality sources and main predators. The predators vary study to study. So in northern Minnesota, it's largely bobcats, but not very many male fishers were killed by predators in that study. I think only 4. Most of the male fishers that they had good information from the DNR, Minnesota DNR study, I think most of them were actually bald eagles. But most of the predation mortality in northern Minnesota is females, and it's bobcats, largely bobcats. We don't know yet down here. We've already seen, we see coyotes like crazy down here. And so we think coyotes are probably going to be a big one. We've already seen some predation by coyotes. We've seen coyotes visit reproductive dens. There are studies out west. Bobcats are a big predator everywhere they overlap. Out west, with some of the populations in California, mountain lions are a big predator on males. Bobcats are a big predator on females. So male fisher to bobcat, there's still a size difference, but it's a little more even in terms of we don't see that as high. And then in terms of your other question was lifespan. Yes, thank you. So where there's no harvest, they can live to 12 years. It's rare. Where we have harvest like Minnesota, they don't typically live beyond 3 to 5, but it varies. I mean, we have some individuals even in the DNR study that lived towards a decade. Diseases is something that we don't have really good information on. We don't see that as a large source of mortality where we've studied mortality, and we being the collective research community. One threat that has emerged, and something, it's a study that we'd like to do in the future, is rodenticides. So first identified in California with illegal marijuana grow operations. There have been some recent studies in the Northeast that have found really high rates of rodenticide exposure in fishers. And so that's more in the health realm. It's not diseases. Yeah, where they live, rabies isn't usually very prevalent because it tends to be cold, snowy areas. They would be likely susceptible to parvo, distemper. They would be susceptible to COVID. We've not, from my understanding, people that have surveyed for that in fishers have not typically found a lot. They don't live areas even here. They don't spend a lot of time in areas with a lot of fishers, but I don't think we had any pictures, but we are still masking when we handle them just to be as cautious as we can be. And then other mortality factors, and we'll come here, sorry. We do think roadkill is a lot bigger mortality factor down here than in the north. And so as they're moving through that landscape, out in Albany, New York, there was a really cool study where they tracked fishers and they found them using culverts under the interstate. And when they see that as a risk, they're very crafty and they can avoid it. It's getting them to look both ways before they cross the street. That's an issue. Yeah, back here. Sorry. Yeah, so the question was, do they have competitors that would limit their ability to occupy habitats? A lot of the predators are predators because they're competitors. So bobcats, coyotes, they do have overlap in their niche and what they eat. We think prey competition is a big reason why that predation happens. It's also, so fishers have been documented in the Northeast killing lynx kittens. And so if I'm a bobcat or a coyote, I can't think of a good reason to have a fisher running around my territory in terms of prey competition, but also my young. So we think that's a big part of it, but there is a lot of our carnivores, mesocarnivores, have extensive overlap in habitat and diet and in some places in activity as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's hit the online ones and we'll come back here. Yep. So the question, do we have data on prey species consuming? Yeah, we're working through that. The scats and the stable isotopes. We're also trying, next fall, we'll be quantifying prey availability so we can compare it to the north, because we think there's more squirrels here, but until we count them, that's just speculation. Yeah, so the question, what's the most surprising thing we found? I'd say some of the areas that fishers turn up has always surprised me. We had one that was incidentally trapped in the Norwood Young America area this summer, and in an area that, man, you'd have to go for miles to find what I'd call good fisher habitat. So that has surprised me. We think that's probably young fishers dispersing. We think that available space is probably pretty saturated in the Southeast. And so if a young fisher needs to go find a range, they might have to go through places they wouldn't otherwise go. The other thing that surprised me, and again, it's a preliminary result, but just how small of the home ranges that we're seeing females use, those are marten-sized home ranges. We have martens using the same amount of space in the north. So that's been really surprising as well. Yeah. So fishers are a fur bear species. There is a legal harvest season for them. In the South, there's not a harvest season. Some of the information we have from fishers in the South has come from incidentally trapped. So if you legally set a trap for a bobcat and it catches a fisher, it's only illegal if you try to sell the pelt. If you call a conservation officer and report it, they'll come and take it. And, but yeah, so I'm guessing with any wildlife harvest, there's some illegal activity that goes on with fishers, but mostly no. Yeah, so the question was where humans are very active recreating, is that going to be an issue for fishers? I don't have direct data on that right now, but where we're finding them show up, including some of the parks within the metro, I'd have to say no, probably not. They're very good at knowing you're there before you do. They're there and running off, climbing a tree. They can be really a pain to track in the summer when they're generally on a branch resting or in a nest, because you get close, they know you're coming and they'll just take off. In the winter, it's a little better because they don't want to leave their warm site. But yeah, I think they're good at modifying what they're doing to avoid us. 1 second, I think we have a third question. No. Yeah. So the question is, was my interest in weasels related to exposure to wind in the willows? I can't describe my interest in weasels. My wife questions it all the time, but they're just cool species. It's a really diverse group. They've really evolved a lot of different strategies to handle the how do I survive, how do I eat question. And I think they're one of the more diverse carnivore groups. And so a lot of the weasel species I study serve as predators and prey. So there's a little extra wrinkle that you have to think about in their ecology, but it wasn't wind in the willows, but just, I don't know. Sorry, we'll come back. Yeah. So the question was, what does the pelt of the fisher feel like? Female fishers have very, very fine fur. There's a researcher named Roger Powell who literally wrote the book on the fisher, University of Minnesota Press. I don't remember, 93, I think, was the last version on that. He has been quoted numerous times as saying that the most beautiful animal in the world is a female fisher. And there's this kind of funny story where he said that to a reporter on a fishery introduction he was working on in California. And the reporter said, "Does your wife know that you think that?" And he said, "Yeah." And she agrees with me. So their fur is very beautiful. It has characteristics that people desire for fur market. But yeah, I should have brought a pelt too. I'm sorry. We have one in our collection, but yeah. Any domestic animals like ducks, geese, things like that? So the question is, do they pose a risk to domestic animals? And you've given me an opportunity first to make a point that I didn't make in my presentation, which the question I usually get is, do they pose a risk to game species like turkeys? And that's another reason why we're interested in diet, is as they moved in this area, are they an extra source of mortality that we need to think about for some of the prey species? The question about domestic animals, the number one question I get is, are they going to attack cats and kids? And kids, no. Cats, mostly not. I'll get to the other domestic animals in a second. There was a study in somewhere in the Northeast that looked in a human-dominated landscape to identify whether they're killing feral cats. And they found a very small rate of fish remains. As someone else already mentioned, they're about the size of a cat. And so that's, in some cases, going to be a risk that even a male fisher is probably not going to take. It happens. For folks that are worried about that, I always remind them that we've never seen evidence that a fisher can open your front door and come in. So if you keep your cat inside, they're perfectly safe from fishers. But when it comes to other animals, other domestic animals, chickens, ducks, they could pose a threat to them. Yes. I know I've had a video from Washington County, I believe, of them running around. I think there was a rabbit. It was a wild rabbit, but it was caught in a fence and it found and dispatched that. But yeah, there is potentially some risk there. We don't commonly find those remains. When I think of those sorts of depredation situations, at least in the north, I'm generally thinking of bobcats. We've had some of our animals that we've collared up there that have gotten themselves into a whole world of trouble by killing people as domestic animals. So there is potential for that. I'm not sure of any study that's really documented a lot of that, but it is possible. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't have good pictures. I can follow up with the group. So they have the sort of typical weasel 2x2 lope. They have 5 toes. So if you see a good footprint, you would know that it's not a fox or a bobcat or a coyote because they have an extra toe. Depending on size, you can distinguish. Otters are the closest one that I think there's a lot of potential for confusion there. But if anyone sees good tracks and can get a picture with something of known size, that's something that we'd more than happy look at and give our opinion of, even if our opinion is it might be, but we can't say for sure. And I should say too, I've suggested that they're nocturnal. They're not strictly nocturnal, even in human dominated landscapes, but that's the tendency of carnivores in human dominated landscapes. Other questions? Yeah. Sorry, you're next. Because you have another one on Zoom. The Minnesota Zoo, last I knew, has a fisher. I'm trying to think if they have two. They definitely have a fisher, the Minnesota Zoo. They used to. I shouldn't say they definitely do. Good. They still do good. I haven't been there in a number of years. Oh, really? Nice. I didn't realize that. And I don't know if the Minnesota Zoo did, but I know there was talk of them getting a marten as well. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, some members of the public refer to fishers as mean killing machines. How do you deal with that? Man, we hear that a lot about weasels, that they're bloodthirsty and that they're killing to kill. I don't know of a carnivore, I mean, domestic cats. I don't know of a carnivore, a wild carnivore that's afforded the opportunity to kill for kill. It's really about survival for them. They will surplus kill if they get the opportunity. They will cache food. I hear this a lot. Fishers are mean. Fishers are vicious. They're ferocious. They'll attack you. Stay away from them. And generally, when I probe people that have that opinion, I find that they've never been up close by a fisher. They're very docile in traps. I've never had one even, I mean, we let them go and they just run away as fast as they can. If you're a prey species, yeah, they probably are vicious. And it's how they make a living. Carnivores are hard to argue for sometimes, but yeah. Do any more online? We'll go here and then you're next. Yeah, so we use live trap cage, raccoon size, I should say, but cage traps. And I should say too, it's not always clear when I give these presentations. We go through a very rigorous project to get approval to do that. We have state permits, we have landowner permits, we have institutional animal use and care approval so that our protocols are humane. And so we check them at a high frequency. If we don't have the opportunity to collar them, we'll let them go immediately. Same with any bycatch that we get, raccoons and other things. Skunks are our favorite. Yeah, so really good comment here with tracks, especially in the mud or the snow. Their claws are apparent in their tracks. Yeah. And so that would be a good way also to distinguish them from bobcats. Yep. Question is, how do they get along with raccoons? Yeah, that's a good question that I don't know if I have a good answer to. I think our biggest concern with raccoons and fishers is the potential for disease exposure. Some of the diseases that raccoons carry and spread because they're more of a communal species. We've seen raccoons visit their reproductive dens. They can't get in. Um, I don't know, but I would speculate. I've never seen a video or an account of a direct interaction between the two. I would speculate that raccoons in general are bigger than them. And so Fisher's response is probably generally going to be to get out of there, climb a tree, get where they can't get you. I don't know, but they do raid nests. I don't know if they raid eagle nests. Maybe that's why the male fishers have ended up dead from eagles. But yeah, they will raid nests. I'm not sure if anyone's ever seen that. I haven't been aware of it. And I can stay after too. I think we're gonna close, but one more and then I'm happy to stay after if there are more questions. Yeah. That's a really good question. Does the fur of fishers change color? It really doesn't. The appearance changes a little bit. So this time of year, they've gotten their winter coat, usually early October, about now. And so as you get through winter, they might look a little ragged from just damaging those hair cells, and then they lose them. So they look different as they're molting, but they're pretty much grizzled brown, darker on the hind end and the tail year round. All right, thank you.
So I'll gather some of the follow-up information from Michael, and if you will look when I send out the invite for the next meeting and kind of read through it, I'll put it at the bottom of that email that I send. I think most of you get that, don't you? It's kind of notification of the next meeting. If you don't, go to subscribe on the website and then you'll get it. So anyway, thank you again, Mike.
Yeah. One more. We have to get here by 8:30. I'm heading back tonight, but I don't have.
It's not a hard stop.
Okay. Yeah, if there are more questions, I'm happy to stay. Yeah.